Welcome back to Black Tapes. It's been a while, and I want to thank everyone who's been patiently waiting for the next episode. Your support means the world. And today, we're returning with one of the most haunting true crime stories in American history. In November 1957, police in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, entered the farmhouse of a quiet man named Ed Gein. What they found inside would change the course of American crime and inspire some of the most disturbing characters in film history. Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. All of them trace their origins back to this one story, a tale of isolation, obsession, and madness buried deep within rural America. This is the story of Ed Gein, the real psycho. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. From the beginning, his life was marked by hardship, control, and isolation. His parents, George and Augusta Gein, were a deeply mismatched pair. George was a violent alcoholic who drifted between jobs, while Augusta was a strict and domineering woman who ruled her household through fear and religion. She believed that the world was sinful, that women were instruments of temptation, and that only through strict obedience could her sons avoid eternal damnation. When Ed was still a child, Augusta moved the family to a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Plainfield, a quiet rural town surrounded by fields and woods. The move was meant to isolate her family from what she saw as the moral decay of society. For Ed and his older brother Henry, this meant a childhood spent almost entirely cut off from the outside world. They were forbidden from making friends, and their only education in morality came from their mother's long, fiery sermons. At school, Ed was shy and withdrawn. His classmates remembered him as strange but polite, often ridiculed for his timid demeanor and awkward social behavior. He tried to fit in, but never succeeded. His teachers noted that he was bright and obedient, yet emotionally immature. The constant ridicule from other children only deepened his dependence on his mother, the one person whose approval he desperately sought. Life on the Gein farm was bleak. George's alcoholism led to frequent arguments, and Augusta's authority was absolute. She preached that women were the root of all evil, and Ed grew up internalizing that belief. Despite her cruelty, he adored her and saw her as his moral compass. The small farmhouse became both his world and his prison. In 1940, when Ed was 34 years old, his father died of heart failure brought on by years of drinking. This left Ed and his brother Henry to care for the farm and their aging mother. Henry, however, had begun to see through Augusta's control and occasionally criticized her behavior. This worried Ed deeply. In his mind, his brother's disobedience was a form of betrayal against their mother's authority. In 1944, tragedy struck. While the brothers were burning brush near their property, the fire spread unexpectedly. When it was finally extinguished, Ed reported Henry missing. Later that evening, searchers found Henry's body lying face down on the ground. Though the official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation, many locals thought the circumstances were suspicious. Ed had led police directly to the body, in an area they had already searched. There were rumors of bruises on Henry's head, but no investigation followed. With Henry gone, Augusta's hold over Ed became complete. Her health soon began to fail, and Ed devoted himself entirely to her care. When she suffered a stroke, he nursed her obsessively, spending nearly all his time at her bedside. But in December 1945, she died, leaving Ed utterly alone. Her death shattered his already fragile psyche. The one person he loved, feared, and depended on was gone. Without her, Ed Gein's world collapsed into silence. After her death, Ed sealed off her bedroom, leaving it untouched as a shrine to her memory. The rest of the farmhouse fell into decay, filled with clutter, dust, and darkness. He spent his days doing odd jobs for neighbors, reading pulp magazines, and collecting books about anatomy and death. The isolation that had defined his childhood now consumed his adulthood. In the quiet fields of Plainfield, no one could see how far he was beginning to slip from reality. What had once been an odd but harmless man was slowly becoming something else. A figure of obsession, haunted by the voice of his mother and drawn toward the darkness she had planted within him. After Augusta Gein's death, the small town of Plainfield barely noticed the quiet man who kept mostly to himself. To the townspeople, Ed was simply another local, shy, awkward, and a little strange, but never threatening. He fixed fences, repaired engines, and occasionally babysat for neighbors. He laughed at the right moments, paid his bills on time, and was polite to everyone he met. For years, there was no reason to think anything was wrong. Plainfield was the kind of community where everyone knew each other's names. News traveled fast, but gossip faded even faster. And so, Ed Gein slipped easily into the background. He was the man you'd see walking into the hardware store, or sitting quietly in a diner booth, staring out the window as snow fell on Main Street. But beneath his quiet surface, Ed's world was shrinking. The rooms in his farmhouse, once alive with his mother's voice, had turned into tomb-like spaces, filled with dust and silence. He lived mostly in the kitchen and one small side room, keeping the rest of the house sealed away like a museum of memories. Over time, his interests turned darker. He began reading crime magazines, anatomy books, and stories about death and grave robbing. At first, he claimed it was just curiosity, but neighbors began to notice small things: tools missing from sheds, holes dug in the cemetery, the occasional disappearance of livestock. No one wanted to believe it could be Ed. Children whispered that his farmhouse was haunted. Adults laughed it off. But the townsfolk all agreed on one thing. There was something unsettling about the way Ed Gein looked at people. His eyes lingered too long, as if searching for something only he could see. By the mid-1950s, Plainfield had grown used to its quiet handyman. But behind those boarded-up windows, Ed was already crossing a line no one could have imagined. The man the town thought it knew was slipping further into a private world of delusion, one that would soon shock the entire country. It was a cold November morning in 1957 when the quiet town of Plainfield changed forever. Bernice Warden, the 58-year-old owner of the local hardware store, hadn't shown up for church that Sunday. Her truck was missing, the shop was empty, and the cash register was open, with a few bills gone. For a town as small as Plainfield, that was enough to cause alarm. Her son, Frank Warden, was also a deputy sheriff. When he entered the store, he noticed something else: a sales slip for antifreeze, written out the previous day. The customer's name on the slip was one everyone knew: Ed Gein. Deputies drove out to Ed's farmhouse on the edge of town. The property sat silent beneath a gray Wisconsin sky, its windows dark and boarded up. The front door was locked, but the back door gave way with a push. As the officers stepped inside, the beam of their flashlights cut through years of dust and decay. The smell of rot and old wood filled the air. What they discovered inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. The house was a maze of clutter and filth. Piles of newspapers, tools, broken furniture, and objects no one could explain. The officers stopped cold as their flashlights moved across the room. It was clear that something terrible had happened there. They called for backup. Within hours, the small farmhouse was surrounded by police cars, and word began to spread through Plainfield that a major discovery had been made. Neighbors watched from a distance, confused and afraid. The quiet handyman they had known for years was suddenly the center of the biggest police operation their town had ever seen. By the following morning, every newspaper in Wisconsin carried the same headline. Reporters flooded Plainfield, eager to understand how such horror could exist in a place so ordinary. The town was in disbelief. not only because of what the police had found, but because it had all been hiding in plain sight. When officers located Ed later that evening, he didn't resist. He simply admitted that he knew what they were looking for. His calmness unsettled everyone who met him that night. The world would soon learn the full extent of what had been discovered inside that house. In the days following his arrest, Ed Gein sat quietly in the Waushara County Sheriff's Office. Officers described him as calm, polite, even helpful, a man who spoke with the same mild tone he used when fixing a neighbor's fence. But behind that calmness was something far more unsettling, a complete lack of understanding about the gravity of what he had done. As investigators began questioning him, Gein offered answers freely, almost casually. He spoke about his mother, Augusta, with reverence, describing her as pure, holy, and the only person who ever truly understood him. Every sentence seemed to circle back to her. Detectives quickly realized that her death had become the breaking point, the event that shattered what little stability he had left. Psychiatrists were brought in to assess his mental state. They found a man deeply disconnected from reality, living in a world shaped by loneliness and delusion. He spoke of hearing his mother's voice, guiding him, telling him what was right and wrong. To Ed, she had never really died. She was still there, commanding his thoughts and actions. Investigators also pieced together the scale of what had taken place at the Gein farm. They interviewed townspeople who recalled years of odd behavior, his strange laughter, the way he would suddenly disappear for hours at night, his fascination with local obituaries. It became clear that Plainfield's quiet handyman had been living in complete psychological isolation, consumed by obsession and fantasy. For the people of Wisconsin, it was almost impossible to process. This was not a criminal mastermind or a violent outlaw. It was a man they had known for years, someone they had trusted. Reporters described him as ordinary beyond belief, a phrase that would later echo in countless true crime stories that followed. As the investigation unfolded, one truth became undeniable. Ed Gein's actions had not come from greed, anger, or revenge. They had come from a place of profound psychological collapse. A lonely man trying, in his own delusional way, to bring back the only person he had ever loved. When psychiatrists presented their findings to the court, the conclusion was unanimous. Ed Gein was legally insane, incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. He was declared unfit for trial and committed indefinitely to a state mental hospital. But even as he disappeared behind the walls of the institution, the legend of Ed Gein began to grow. His story spread far beyond Wisconsin, becoming a symbol of America's fascination with the unknown darkness that can hide behind ordinary faces. In 1958, the case of Ed Gein officially moved to trial, though it was unlike any other in Wisconsin's history. The courtroom was filled with journalists, psychologists, and curious onlookers who had come to see the man whose name had already become synonymous with evil. Yet what they saw wasn't a monster. It was a frail, soft-spoken man with vacant eyes, sitting quietly beside his lawyer. Psychiatrists testified that Gein suffered from severe mental illness. They described him as delusional, trapped in a reality shaped by isolation and the ghost of his mother. The defense argued that he was legally insane, unable to comprehend his actions. The judge agreed. Ed Gein was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. For the next 3 decades, Gein lived out his life within those walls. Reports from doctors and staff described him as cooperative, almost childlike. He worked in the hospital's maintenance department, read comic books, and spoke politely to anyone who approached him. He never showed anger, never raised his voice, just a quiet, empty politeness that made those around him uneasy. He rarely mentioned his past. When asked directly about the crimes, he deflected, claiming he couldn't remember most of it. Whether that was true or simply a coping mechanism, no one could be certain. Over time, his notoriety faded from the headlines, but the legend of Ed Gein only grew stronger outside the hospital walls. In July 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure at the age of 77. His passing made national news once again. Even in death, he remained a figure of fascination, a reminder of how deeply his story had burrowed into the American psyche. But Gein's legacy extended far beyond true crime. His life and actions inspired some of the most iconic horror characters in film history. Norman Bates, the timid motel owner in Psycho; Leatherface, the masked killer in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre; Buffalo Bill, the disturbed antagonist of The Silence of the Lambs. Each of them carried echoes of the quiet man from Plainfield, twisted reflections of his story, reshaped into myth. For decades, writers, filmmakers, and psychologists have debated what Ed Gein truly represented. Was he a product of mental illness, of isolation, of obsession, or a cautionary tale about what can grow in the absence of compassion and connection? In the end, Ed Gein became more legend than man, a ghostly figure who blurred the line between fact and fiction. His story continues to fascinate and horrify, not because of its violence, but because of its ordinary beginnings. A small farmhouse, a quiet man, and a darkness no one saw coming. The story of Ed Gein is a haunting reminder that darkness can exist in the most ordinary places. It's not just a story about crime. It's a story about loneliness, obsession, and the dangers of a mind left unchecked. If you found this documentary insightful, please consider subscribing to Black Tapes. Your support helps us continue creating long-form true crime documentaries that bring you the full stories behind the headlines. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you prefer these deeper, single-case episodes, or the multi-case iceberg format we used before? Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow, and I truly appreciate every one of you who's been part of the journey. Thank you for watching, and for keeping these stories alive.